Now let's talk about directionality and the mode property on bindings. Bindings can flow data in two directions. From the source to the target is the standard direction to populate data on the screen, but also from the target back down to the source if you're doing two-way data binding. The default mode for a binding is really determined by the dependency property that's the target of that binding. So when that dependency property is declared, if it doesn't say anything, the default is going to be one way. But through its property metadata, it can indicate that it wants to be a two-way binding by default, such as the text property on a text box or any primary property that's an edit input on editable controls. So in WPF, the primary properties of editable controls are set to two-way by default, but other read-only controls such as a label and other properties will be one-way by default. Just be aware if you're using other XAML technologies, the other XAML technologies don't do this. All properties are one-way by default, and you always have to set the mode property to two-way if you mean it to be. But in WPF, they make it a little easier. The way you can influence this in your bindings is simply by setting a mode property on the binding. And it's got a number of values. One-way is the default. Two-way might be the default if it's an editable control. There's one-way to source, which is basically from the target to the source, but it never reads from the source to the target. And then there's one time, which means it reads from the source to the target once, and then it forgets the binding exists. So any changes to the source won't be reflected, even if there's property change notifications, and any editing in the UI will not push any values down to the source object. There's also a value on the enumeration called default, and that's basically saying do whatever the target property wanted to do by default, which again is going to be one way in general by default, but most editable properties on editable controls in WPF are set to two-way by default. So let's take a look at binding mode in a demo.